Today we will be discussing the 6 principles of the Constitution along with a few other parts of the Constitution. So to start off with the 6 principles, limited government was the first principle, and the Founding Fathers decided that a limited government would be better because they didn't want one powerful branch in the government that would take control over the people in the states. The second principle of the Constitution was popular sovereignty, in which the people gave the Constitution its power and people gave the government its power. The third principle of the Constitution was the separation of powers, and it used the limited government and created separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches to separate the powers within the government. The fourth was checks and balances, and it was used to give the government, it was used to keep the government's branches from becoming too powerful. The fifth being federalism, which was the idea of separating powers between the national government and the state government and local governments. And the sixth being judicial review, where the Supreme Court can strike down a law or an executive order. The second question asks, what are 4 ways to amend the Constitution? 2 are proposed by Convention of the States and include ratification by state conventions and ratification by state legislators. The second way is proposed by Congress, and that includes ratification by state conventions, ratification by state legislatures, and the president has no power in this process. It uses federalism, so both federal government and state governments are involved, and the proposal needs 2/3 vote, and ratification needs 3/4 vote. The third question asks, what are the Bill of Rights? The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution make up the Bill of Rights. The first is freedom of speech, religion, and press. Second is right to bear arms. Third is right to not quarter soldiers in your home without permission. Fourth is no unlawful search and seizure without probable cause. Fifth is right to due process, right to not incriminate yourself, law, eminent domain, double jeopardy, grand jury, indictment in felony cases. Sixth is right to a fair and speedy trial, right to know of charges placed against you, and right to have a lawyer, and also right to face your accuser in court. The seventh is right to jury for civil cases. Eighth is no excessive bails, no cruel or unusual punishments. The ninth is unenumerated rights, and the 10th is powers reserved for the states. The fourth question is about the 27 amendments. The first I had read off, first being freedom of speech, religion, and second being the right to bear arms. Third being right not to quarter soldiers in your home without permission. Fourth being no unlawful search or seizure without probable cause. Fifth being right to due process, right to not incriminate yourself, law and eminent domains, double jeopardy, grand jury, and indictment in felony cases. The sixth is right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to know your charges placed against you, the right to have a lawyer, and the right to face your accuser in court. The seventh is right to jury for civil cases. Seventh is no excessive bails, no cruel or unusual punishment. Ninth is no unenumerated rights. 10th is powers reserved for the states. 11th is states can be sued in a federal court by other states of foreign countries. That was in 1794. 12th is the election of both president and vice president together. That was established in 1803. 13 was the abolition of slavery. That was 1865. 14 is getting rid of the 3/5 compromise, which counted each slave as 3/5 of a person rather than a whole person. That was in 1868. 15 was the right to vote for citizens. That was 1870. 16 is federal income tax, 1913. 17 is senator to be elected by voters of the states, and that was also in 1913. 18 was prohibition in 1919. Number 19 was women's rights to vote. That was in 1920. Number 20 is the date of the presidential inauguration moved from March to January following November elections. That was in 1933. 21 repealed the 18th Amendment of Prohibition. That was in 1933 as well. 22, no president may serve more than 2 terms. That was in 1951. 23, Washington, D.C. allowed to have their own electors. That was 1961. 24, no tax was needed to vote. That was also 1964. Excuse me, the last one was 1961. Number 25, allowed for presidential succession. That was 1967. 26 was the right to vote at 18. That was 1971. And the final one, number 27, was Congress cannot vote themselves a pay raise until after the next election. That was in 1992. So we haven't had one in over 20 years, which is a pretty big deal. Kind of cool, but interesting. The 5th question asks, what are 5 ways to informally change the Constitution, and to describe them with examples. So the first one is basic legislation, so passing laws. Passing laws to explain the Constitution and actually using its powers. So figuring out what it means to regulate trade, both internationally and domestically. Second one could be executive action, so using presidential powers and using executive agreements. As far as presidential powers, the president is the chief commander of the armed forces and can make war without declaring a war. Secondly, regarding executive agreements, pacts can be made by the president directly with the head of the foreign state. The third is court decisions, so Supreme Court interprets the Constitution themselves. So what they deem as correct or in accordance with the Constitution is the way that it goes. The fourth is party practices, so influence and change the Constitution. So national conventions before elections or use of the Electoral College is an example of that. And then another is custom, so the president's cabinet is because of custom, not because of the Constitution. So the president's cabinet is ultimately decided by the president, and therefore it's custom. Number 6 asks, what is the organization of the Constitution? So the first part of the Constitution is the preamble, or the intro. The 7 articles follow that. Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2, executive branch. Article 3, judicial branch. Article 4, state relations. Article 5, amendment process. Article 6, provisions or supremacy clause. And Article 7 is ratification. The 27 amendments follow that, which is followed by the first 10 amendments, which is known as the Bill of Rights, and then 11 through 27 precede that. Number 7 asks, what are powers of Congress, the President, and Supreme Court? So Congress, Article 1, Section 8, are peacetime powers. They establish and collect taxes, they borrow money, regulate foreign and interstate commerce, they create naturalization laws, bankruptcy laws, coin money, and regulate its value. They punish federal money, counterfeiters, and they establish post offices, grant patents and copyrights, create inferior courts to Supreme Court, define and punish crimes at sea, manage District of Columbia and other federal properties, and make all laws necessary to do all for the ones that I listed up above. They also, regarding war, they declare war and make laws about captures. They raise and support armies, provide navy, make laws for governing land and naval forces, executive federal laws, suppress uprisings, and repel invasions. And they also organize, arm, and discipline militia. The president is responsible for the following. He is the commander-in-chief. He grants pardons, makes treaties, appoints ambassadors and public ministers, councils, judges. He also gives Congress information on the State of the Union. convenes with one or both houses, receives ambassadors and public ministers. He makes sure that laws are executed faithfully, and commission all officers to the United States. The Supreme Court does the following: judicial review to all cases affecting ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls. And the Supreme Court also appellates jurisdiction both for law and fact. So they interpret the Constitution and make opinions based off of that. The eighth question asks, what are the qualifications of the House, the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court? Starting with the House, you must be at least 25 years old, you must be a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and you must live in the state that you are representing. For the Senate, you must be at least 30 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, and you must live in the state that they are elected. For President, you must be at least 35 years old, a U.S. resident for at least 14 years, and a natural-born citizen to the United States. The Supreme Court, there are no requirements given: age, experience, citizenship rules. The President ultimately appoints the Supreme Court justices. Number 9 asks, what is the term for House, Senate, President, and Supreme Court? So starting with the House, you have 2 years, no limit on number of terms. The senators are elected every 6 years, and they have no limit on their terms. President is elected every 4 years with 2 limits on his term and a max of 10 years. And for Supreme Court and federal judges, they have lifetime terms, and they are appointed by the President. The 10th question asks, what is the full faith and credit clause, privileges and immunities? How does a new state join the Union, and what form of government is guaranteed? So starting with full faith and credit clause, that ensures that states recognize the laws and documents and court proceedings of the other states. The only exceptions are one state can't enforce another state's criminal laws. Second is full faith and credit does not need to be given to certain divorces granted by one state to residents of another state. Privileges and immunities says that no state can draw a reasonable distinction between its own residents and those persons who happen to live in other states. And states can draw reasonable distinctions between its own residents and those for other space. The third being, new state joins the Union with approval from Congress. So new state can be formed with 2 or more current states without consent from state legislatures. And the fourth is Republican form of government is guaranteed. Number 11 asks, what is the Supremacy Clause? What happened to the depths of a country? Oath and test. So Supremacy Clause is Article 6. All depths before the Constitution was created are valid. All laws and treaties made in the United States are the supreme law of the land. Judges bound to laws and constitutions, so judges must follow all laws of the Constitution. Senators, representatives, legislation, executive officers, and judicial officers are bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution to their full extent. And no religious test will ever be required as a qualification to enter any office. So religion does not matter. You can be elected no matter your religion in the United States. Okay, so the 12th question, I'm going to include the bonus within that. So the 12th question asks, what are the requirements for ratification? And for ratification, 9 out of 13 states had to approve the Constitution, but that went against the Articles of Confederation, so that was a big deal. For bonus, it asks, what is treason? Explain. What is impeachment? Who brings charges, jury, proceedings, officer, and explain implied powers with an example. So treason is listed in the Constitution as taking up arms and fighting against the United States or aiding an enemy of the United States. So the Civil War, the North fought against the South. Treason needs 2 witnesses that show an act of treason and can be punished by death or life in prison. Impeachment, you can impeach the president, Supreme Court justices for high crimes and misdemeanors. Punishment could be being kicked out of office. And the House brings the charges. The House votes for impeachment of the president. Senate is the jury. There is a trial, and the Senate rules. Proceeding officers is Chief Justice, so head of trial. Prosecutor is the House of Representatives. Implied powers are powers not named in the Constitution but assumed to exist because they are necessary to implement express powers that are named in the Constitution. So it only really applies to the Congress because of that. And then an example is welfare, or the power to tax, the power to regulate and trade. Thank you.